we good now? I did hit start broadcasting. And it shows my screen there. The infinite well of screens.
It says you're recording, so I'm going to assume you're good.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Yeah. So traditional web apps, the state was entirely managed by the server side. You get a whole page down, and what you can do from there has been returned to you in that page that was responsive. So you're loading an e-commerce site, you click on a certain product section, you want to look at the home decors, whatever. The server sends a whole page down to you, and that page contains everything that you can do from there, every state transition you can do. You can go look at chairs, you can go look at couches, you can look at whatever. All of that is contained in that single response from the server. So all that state, the things we can do now that we're looking at home decor, was returned in that single page response. That's well and good because your browser doesn't need to know about chairs or couches. It just knows, okay, I got back this single page document. There are some links in it. I can follow those links. Your browser doesn't need to know about e-commerce. It doesn't need to know about chairs and couches. So that's traditional web apps. In comes Web 2.0, and all of a sudden we started doing, selective reload of content in those pages. We started saying, okay, we've got our products listing. Now we're going to dynamically, when you click on couches, load the listing of couches instead of loading a whole brand new page for you. User experience is better, blah, blah, blah. The problem became we started spreading that state between the server and the client. We started saying, okay, I've got this page. It's home decor. I get a listing of all the different types of home decor, couches, chairs, whatever, and I'm going to start building some URL I know I need to go to in order to figure out how to load the listing of couches and chairs. I click on a specific chair, I have the details about that chair, weight, blah, blah, blah. I know, my client now knows, okay, in order to order this chair, I'm going to craft this special URL /cart/ad/product ID. I'm going to do a post to it, and I can add that chair to my cart. The problem introduced is now our client is thinking about those state transitions. Our client code is worrying about what can I do with this chair? What can I do with this product? And as a result, we now have the state shared between two places, and we've introduced a lot of coupling. We've introduced redundancy if we have multiple different clients we're implementing, whether it's a mobile app and a web app. All these things that come along with that shared state being in the server and in the client. So Helios, and Hypermedia, Helios is a horrible acronym, we'll see in a second. Hypermedia is the idea of taking that back, moving back to a place where our state is managed in one spot so that we don't have to have as much coupling, we don't have to have as much redundancy in our different clients that we implement, mobile clients, web apps, and we can have one central place that is managing all these things we can do with our resources, whether it's products or blog posts, whatever they may be. And fundamentally, what that boils down to is links. And we'll see what that looks like here soon. I'm going to do a lot of sort of abstract stuff before we get to the specifics here. So, Helios, the horrible down to is Hypermedia as the engine of application state. It's a phrase and acronym came out of the RESTful API, REST dissertation from Roy Fieldings. And it's a bunch of gobbledygook until you really boil down into what that really means. So Hypermedia as the engine of application state. When I'm talking about application state, I'm talking about I'm viewing products. There's the state of your application. I'm viewing products. Or I am viewing a listing of blog posts. And you may want to then transition to a new state. I want to view a specific blog post. That's a state transition. That's going from looking at blog posts to looking at this blog post about kittens. So Hypermedia is the means by which we can do that. Instead of having our client side know, oh, I've got this listing of these things, I know our blog posts, there's some ID field that I'm going to shove into some URL somewhere. Instead of having to have our client manage that application state, it's about using Hypermedia to manage that so that our server can be that one place where all of that state can be consolidated and managed. What you get from doing this is you get reduced coupling. Your client code and your server code don't need to be lockstep. You can design clients that can dynamically handle the fact that certain parts of your API aren't available. Whether you have a portion of your website that might have uptime concerns or needs to be taken down for maintenance. If you're using Hypermedia, you have the ability to easily, dynamically have these fallbacks, have the client handles these different states coming back from the server, and the client is no longer intimately tied to what's going on in your backend. There is a distinct sort of protocol, a mechanism whereby the client has a very, very thin set of things it can make assumptions about on the server side. So not only that, it will avoid duplication. I already mentioned this earlier. If you're writing an API that you need to have serve multiple sort of front-end clients, I mean, if you're writing a web application, maybe a single-page application, JavaScript, and you need to target mobile, let's say you're doing iPhone and you're doing Android, and if you're feeling very generous, you might do Windows Phone. You now have all these different platforms you're writing clients for. And if we can move more and more of our business logic and our rules checking into the server side, it's less times we need to rewrite it in every freaking language. We don't need to write it in JavaScript and Cocoa and C# and whatever. So avoiding that duplication will also be good. Now, HADIOS is a ridiculous acronym. Also, nobody can agree how to pronounce it. So just call it Hypermedia Constraint or Hypermedia. So from now on, I won't use HADIOS. You might see it in some online blog posts. Silly acronym. Just say Hypermedia. Now, I am not going to try and tell you that this is a silver bullet. Hypermedia does not solve all problems, and it certainly can introduce more problems for you. There are certainly cases where you don't want to use Hypermedia in your API design. One of the concerns there is there's more upfront design. It's very easy right now if you're designing an API to say, okay, here's my resource. It's a post listing. Here's my resource with some URL variable for the ID of a specific post. There you go, done. So there's a lot more upfront design for designing what your links look like, what do your resources look like, and how do they link to other places. So that upfront design might be an impact for you. If you need to get to market quickly and you're just trying to get stuff done, you might not choose to do this. Roy Fielding is saying that RESTful APIs are built on scale of decades, and there's a contrary to that. Is if you're on the scale of weeks, you might not want to do Hypermedia. It might not be the right choice for you. In addition to that, it's a larger payload size. If you have an API that's just returning those few fields, the product title, the product weight, and an ID to the product, that's a very small payload. If you're working with a lot of mobile applications where maybe you're really concerned about speed, you've got high latency network, the larger payload size may be a concern for you. And there are ways to mitigate that. There are things you can do to minimize things, maybe selectively get only the set of state transitions that you're interested in, but nonetheless, that might be a concern for you. So if you've got mobile as your primary target and you've already done some analysis and you're pushing the limit on your payload size to fit into one packet, so, well, that might be a concern for you. So not a silver bullet if you're concerned about payload size. Additionally, the tooling is still evolving. As developers, we've gotten really good at understanding, okay, I'm going to consume a RESTful API. There's going to be a set of URLs that I'm going to build for accessing various things, and the tools for building those, whether it's Rails or any of those other frameworks for easily building out a quote-unquote RESTful HTTP API, they're there. The tooling for Hypermedia stuff is still evolving. There are more and more libraries, both for the server side and the client side, popping up constantly. And so that may be a concern. It could be that with the tooling available, you cannot do this. And then lastly, something that's really important, there's a potential for impact to your uptake. If you are designing an API where the API is your business, and it is important you get the most developers using your API as quickly as possible, then maybe Hypermedia isn't a choice for you because it is a new thing. It is not something that your average developer that's just looking to show blog posts on their screen necessarily understands how to use, will be familiar with. So it could turn some people away. So if that is your concern, you're trying to sell this API to get the most people using it now, you might want to avoid a Hypermedia or make it optional. You can very easily serve your API so that depending on the content type they want, if they want to get those Hypermedia controls, they can. If not, they just get the fields with the ID and they can consume it as a traditional API. So certainly some reasons you might not do a Hypermedia API. I'm not going to be a zealot here who's going to tell you Hypermedia all the things. Not going to. So getting down to it, the core fundamental piece of a Hypermedia API is links. And links at a minimum, as a concept, is a link relation and a URL associated with that with a link relation. And that might be a template we can look at that a little bit later. But fundamentally, it's some link relation. That link relation could be anything from next or previous to some custom link relation for pharmacy orders. Nonetheless, that is a plain text identifier to identify a particular link. Conceptually, we can think about this as humans. When we look at a web page, a link to us is some text that we're going to say, I'm looking at this web page. Oh, this thing says comfy chairs. I'm going to click on the comfy chairs link. As a human, we don't inspect the URL for comfy chairs and say, oh, okay, it's going to be load me /chairs/ category 123. As humans, we look at the text of the link, comfy chairs. Hypermedia clients, they inspect the link relation to determine whether they want to use it. They're going to say, okay, this is the next link relation. I'm going to use this to figure out what next resource I'm going to load. So again, Hypermedia clients no longer are building URLs. They're not inspecting URLs to see what's in them. They're looking at the link relation to determine what to do with them. Just like us humans will look at the text of a link to determine whether we want to click it or not. So that's what links are. And here are a couple examples. The concept of a link can be present in a bunch of different formats, different ways. For instance, there's a standard header, a link header, that has a particular URL, and the rel attribute here will show us what the relation is. So that first example, we have a link with a link relation of next, and the URL happens to be /API/posts page 2, for instance. HTML, if you've written a single HTML page in your life, you've probably linked to a style sheet, and you've given it a link relation of style sheet, and the href would be the URL where to find that style sheet. So here's a concrete example that many of you have probably already used day after day. Fundamentally, that is a link. Your browser doesn't know about /css/main.css. It just knows I have a link relation of think style sheet. I'm going to load that like a style sheet for my web page. Similarly, Atom XML, if you've ever subscribed to a particular feed that uses Atom instead of RSS, Atom has the concept of links, so you can have a link relation with a relation of next, and the href is a particular URL. So those are links, and for a lot of my examples coming up here, I'm going to be using a hypermedia format called HAL, which has another way for encoding links, but I wanted to break you in by looking at some links that you've probably, at least in the HTML case, seen before. So that's what a link is, and they are the fundamental piece of how you can make a Hypermedia API and stop having your clients building URLs and trying to figure out what can I do with this set of data that I have. So let's look, for example, at a Datacentric API. And because I'm in the healthcare industry, I'm going to use sort of a healthcare domain. This is going to be a pharmacy order. So if we do a GET for a particular pharmacy order, traditional Datacentric API will return us a bunch of data about an order. So we know that this is an order with an ID of 123. We know the particular dosage of our order. It's going to be an oral order. The schedule is BID. It happens to be a PRN order, blah, 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 blah. So all this data about a pharmacy order. Now, as a developer, especially one that might not know healthcare, can anybody tell me what can I do with a pharmacy order? Any hands? What can I do with a pharmacy order?
You could cancel it.
How do you know you can cancel it?
I don't know.
Right. Right. We can guess that maybe we can cancel it. We can maybe refer to some documentation that says if I want to cancel an order, then I can go to the special URL by introducing our ID parameter into it. But I don't know that I can cancel it. And maybe I'm a pharmacy tech, not a pharmacist, and pharmacy techs can't cancel orders. So you can make assumptions, but all of a sudden that's that coupling of your client. Your client now needs to know, oh, okay, I logged in as a pharmacy tech, so I know I can build this special URL to go cancel my pharmacy order. Now, the alternative with Hypermedia is this. Now, this is what I was talking about, introducing a larger payload size. Our data coming back is bigger, but it tells us a lot more. We now know, okay, we have a self-link. It's our own resource. Some busy work there. We now know that we can do an Rx verify, and we can do an Rx flag. So our particular user that has called our API, now we know we can verify or flag this pharmacy order. And the nice thing is our server can control what next states we can get to by checking, are we a pharmacy tech? Are we allowed to? If it's already verified, we might not be able to cancel an order. We might need to discontinue it because the patient already has technically received some of the dosages of that order, right? So Hypermedia is all about adding this here so our client doesn't need to guess what it can do with our resource. So This is, at a fundamental level, the idea behind Hypermedia API. Our state transitions, we can start flagging this order, we can verify this order, is something that the server can tell us, our client doesn't need to know. So Hypermedia Clients now are an entirely different beast. Instead of having our client code saying, okay, I've gotten some fields back for an order, I know I need to add a link for verification and a link for discontinue, and when they click on it, I'm going to build some URL. Our client now really is just coded against link relations. Our client needs to say, okay, maybe they dynamically present any of the link relations as actions to the user. So in our previous example, maybe they just inspect all the links that return back from a pharmacy order, make them into buttons on the screen, and when you click them, they automatically do that thing. Or they may be hard-coded against a certain set of link relations, because the link relations become our interaction point, our thing that we know we can depend on. We might design a client that is always going to have a verify button that is tied to the rx:verify link relation. We're not tied to URLs. The server can choose to change that URL if it wants to. It might decide to serve it on some back-end server. It might decide to farm it out to some other servers that are load balanced. It doesn't care. Our client just says, okay, I'm going to follow verify when you click on the verify button. And all they need to do is they change the state of the client by following a given link. They don't need to build URLs. They don't need to have business logic around, am I allowed to do this thing? Am I an administrator that's allowed to edit the comfy chair resource and change the price on it? The client doesn't need to know that. The client just needs to know, is there an edit link? Okay, then I guess I can edit this thing. And very, very important, they do not build URLs. The URL namespace is the land of the server. It's the land of the API, and it's not the client's job to worry about what fields do I put where. So, moving to somewhere a little bit more familiar, a traditional API that might be for a blogging engine. And this is getting a particular page of the, a paginated collection of all the posts that are available for this particular blog. Traditional API, there's some post property. It's an array of posts with a certain title and some tags, right? How do we get to the next page and the previous page of posts? You might inspect the URL and say, okay, I have a page equals 2 and a size equals 5. Maybe I'll do a next link where I increment some number. And I'm going to keep the page size the same, right? That's a traditional way of thinking whereby we need to worry about those details. And maybe there's some fields that come back in our response for the page number to make it easier for us. But there's a different way to do it whereby the client can be so much simpler. So let's look at what that looks like when we just want to get to the next and previous pages. And you'll notice here I have particularly specifically obfuscated my URLs because the URLs do not matter. It can be Bob's your uncle, and your client should not care. So now we know how to get to the next and previous page. The client doesn't need to worry about whether it's query parameters or whether it's some path in the URL. Our client just needs to know, is there a next link or is there a previous link? That's it. That's all our client needs to know or needs to interact with in order to page through our blog engine. So the view, and I'm going to use AngularJS views here. It happens to be what I've been working with and work a lot lately. This could just as easily be some native mobile app. Fundamentally, I'm using a web single-page application thing. In our pagination control, when we want to go back or forward, all we need to do is either follow the prev or the next link relation. And if we want to show whether we actually can go back or can go forward, we just need to check for the presence of a particular link relation. This is a very powerful way that clients can start having conditional behavior based on not, oh, am I an administrator? I know I'm an administrator, so I'm allowed to edit things. Our conditional behavior can be based on, do I have a link relation of this particular link relation of edit or next or previous? So we can very easily disable that previous button if there's no previous page, and our server has told us there either is or there isn't a previous page of posts to get. So our view is really simple. And if anybody has looked at any of the like the Rails views for doing pagination, if you're doing Ruby on Rails, it has all this business logic in the view for doing the next page or the previous page. I mean, this took me 5 minutes to write a pagination control for doing pagination of a resource. Next and previous links, and that's it. And our controller is just as simple. We defined a follow function that our view was using. It's a function that takes a particular link relation, which might be the next or the previous link relation, and we replace ourselves with what happens when we follow that link relation. At a fundamental level, that's all it takes to get to the next page. You want to follow this link, and whatever comes back to us, that's going to be the next page of stuff. And our client here is using the knowledge of link relations to make those decisions. That's really where all of our coupling is, and where our documentation ends up lying when we write Hypermedia APIs and Hypermedia Clients. We document the link relations, and there are standard link relations, such as next, prev, style, sheet. Those are all standardized, and there's some governing body that manages standardizing. And you can also write custom link relations. I'm happy using the standard one, next and previous. Those are well known to be link relations to indicate the next or previous set of items in a resource, a collection resource, right? So that's where our coupling lies. We know next and previous. That's all our client knows. Now, how would I jump to page 3? Anybody tell me how I'd jump to page 3? We can't right now. There's no way for us to know what page 3 is. But our API can let us know what page to jump to. And it can let us know, depending on how big our collection gets, it might know, okay, there's now 50 pages worth of stuff. I'm not going to let you jump to every single page. I might let you jump to page 1, 2, and 3, or jump to page 50 and 51. So our API now can include different sections of our collection that we want to be able to let the user navigate to. So now not only do we know we can get to the next and previous page, we know if we want to jump to a certain section of our collection, we want to jump to page 2 of all the blog posts on our blogging engine, we have a link for that. And I happen to not use particularly obscured URLs. Again, the URL does not matter to our client. Our client can be coded against the fact that the section link relation will be an array of sections that the client can view. Now here I've added some new fields. Link relations at their essence are just links are a link relation and a URL, but there are extra attributes, standard attributes, and you can also add your own attributes if you want to, that can be associated with a link relation. Here we have a title. And so our client doesn't need to worry about how do I label these pages. Our server can return them to us, and our server could even, if we need to support translation, our server can return the correct, let's say you're doing page 1, page 2 as a label. You can set an extra header for whatever the languages you want to be using. Our server can return us the right translated title, whatever. But fundamentally now we have a link relation. We can jump to a certain section, and it tells us what the label should be. And our client can be, enhanced with a fairly minimum level of effort to support this. And unfortunately, my screen isn't big enough to show all this. But now we previously were hard-coded against a certain, the prev and next are either there or they're not. Now we're going to iterate all of the sections that are available, and for each of those sections, we'll put an extra list item in there. And for our label for our link, we can pull the title from the title field of that particular link relation. So again, our view isn't building URLs. It isn't even at this point trying to figure out how it should label these things. All it needs to know is it can iterate all of those pages, and for each of those links in the page, we might click it and jump to that section, and here's the label. And we can even figure out whether we're on this current page, and we can set an extra CSS attribute just by not inspecting URLs, but comparing these opaque things. We can see if our current self link, and I told you there was some busy work around the self link. The self link is sort of like, it's me, it's my own location. I can just inspect whether my own location is the same URL as this particular section is. So we can show that if you've clicked on page 2, that page 2 link will be the active one. So the user can see, oh, I'm on page 2. So now we can dynamically not only present next and forward, but we can have any number of sections we can jump to in our view. And again, our controller, very, very simple. Now, because we've iterated all these, we're going to be following a particular, oh, I have a typo here. Excuse me for my JavaScript not being JavaScript. But our scope.section function would take as parameter a particular link object. So instead of following a link relation, we've already followed the link relation at this point. We now have this link object we're going to follow. And we're just going to replace ourselves whatever happens when we load that URL. So our client is it's 2 extra functions in your controller. It's a bare minimum of HTML in your view, and now you've got pagination. And I use pagination because it's really simple. This could just as easily be performing some action like verification. It could just as easily be a verify link that then loads the verify UI in your single-page application or in your mobile app, whatever. Fundamentally, our client just knows about link relations. It can dynamically choose to do things based on the presence of those link relations or not. And it's no longer building URLs. It's no longer doing business logic around is there a next page or not? No, there's just is there a next link or not? So that's all well and dandy. Unfortunately, web applications present a unique challenge for us. In particular, web applications, users have an expectation that they can share a link in their application. They can be looking at a web page, be looking at page 3 of posts on the blogging engine, and they want to post that URL to Twitter so they can tell their friends, I'm looking at this page of stuff about kittens, whatever. And the problem becomes that state of your web application is now tied to some middle state of the API you're using. So if I'm looking at page 3 of blog posts and I want to load page 3 of blog posts when a user follows that link on Twitter, I need to figure out how am I going to take that state in our web app. Our web app might have some URL that says my blog engine /page/3. And that's going to load some JavaScript that's going to go try and load the 3rd page of posts from our API. And now we have that state of our web app and the state of our API. And we need to transfer that state from our web app to our API. If we were just entering there from the very entry point of our application, we'd follow some links to get there. But now we're trying to say, okay, I want to start in the middle. I want to jump myself right to this location. So you have options. If you are designing a web app that is sort of a black box, there's no expectation of deep linking into our web app. If you, let's say it's some game, and you don't expect to be able to link to the 3rd level of your maze, then we can design our web app like a black box. And it would be great if we could always do this, but if we never need a deep link into our application, it's always the user goes to mywebsite.com and they go from there. Then that parallels our API where we start at some entry point of our API and we navigate from there. So Blackbox Web Apps with no deep linking are really simple because the state transitions in our web app follow those state transitions in our API. But we often don't get to do that. We often don't get to say, oh, it's easy, you just go to mysite.com and you click on favorites. If someone wants to share that link on Twitter to get to that specific page of posts, we don't have the luxury of having some black box where it's just some website you go to and you click links from there. We want to load page 3. So deep link web apps where you have some URL that the user has some expectation they can share it and load that specific page of posts. We have these 2 URL spaces. We have our web application URL space /page/2, and we have our API URL space. And fundamentally what that means is it requires our API state navigation to be controlled based on the state that's in our browser URL. So we start introducing coupling between our client and our API. Now, we can minimize that. But nonetheless, we have some state in our client application, and we want to jump to some state in our API, viewing a specific page of posts. The way you can do this with the Hypermedia API to minimize the impact of this coupling so that you don't have the same problems you had before where you're building some URL /pages/123, and I know that that's the URL I want to build, is you can use URI templates. A URI template is basically you may use them often in various programming languages where you're designing what your server says the API is for loading it. It's a way to introduce certain variables into a URL without having the client really know what the final URL will be. So, unfortunately, I really should have put an example here, but actually I think I have one coming up. Here's an example of an API that lets you do deep linking. And there's some coupling introduced, and we can see what that is. when we do get/API, we see that one of the links that are available is post template. And it's a templated link, meaning there is some extra state that needs to be provided in order to follow this link relation. Previously, we had the next and the previous link relations. You can just follow them. Okay, there's some URL. I know I can go to the next link by just following it. But now we want to say, I need to follow this URL, and there's some additional state, the specific post I want to load, that is state that isn't inherent in my link relation. It's state that needs to be provided when we want to follow this link relation so we can get to the specific post. And that's where our coupling lies. We know that for our browser URL, if we're looking at the post with some database ID of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that in order to load that post from our API, all we need to say is, here's the ID, figure out for me what the final URL should be. So we have some link relation that almost gets there, but there's some additional piece of information, some state that's coming from our browser that needs to get put into the final URL in order to follow it. And that's where the coupling lies. Now we know that our browser URL that has /post/123, that 123 piece is the piece that specifically our API needs in order to load our post. And that's where this template comes in. And what that looks like is, let's say, and again, I'm using AngularJS here. If anyone has any questions specifically on the Angular foo here, fundamentally, route provider is the router mechanism in AngularJS. We say that when our browser loads the URL /post/post ID, that we're going to load a particular controller, load a view. We're going to resolve the root API, that thing that I showed previously here. We're going to fetch this beforehand. And our controller now needs to load the specific post for us. And it knows I have a particular link relation I want to use, the post template link relation, and I need to give it a little bit more data in order for that to be a URL I can use. So fundamentally now our post controller is going to say, follow this link relation. Oh, and here's the extra data you need to actually give me the post that I want. Our coupling is now the fact that we had to hard code some random URL in our client with some parameter, the post ID, that happens to be the specific parameter that our template needs in order to get us a post. And if our server changes because we start doing multi-tenant, and in order to load a post, you now need to not only provide the post ID, but provide the tenant ID of the tenant that's using your blogging engine, our client breaks. Because our client now only know the post ID. Someone deep linked to some post ID, but the API says, well, I don't know what to do with this because I'm a multi-tenant solution that has a different database per tenant, and post ID isn't enough to get me to the state you want. So there's risk here. This is reducing some of the benefits of the Hypermedia API, but might be something that you need to do. It might be a necessary evil of consuming a Hypermedia API from a web client that consumers expect to be able to follow, share links to. I think there's some interesting room for future exploration whereby we have a routing mechanism that isn't hard-coded. Here we have the route provider when/post/post ID. I think it would be very interesting if we start having routing mechanisms that instead of hard-coding what pieces of state we store in order to restore the state in the API land, that we can determine automatically what state our API is depending on and throw those in the URLs for us instead of hard-coding them, mixing those URL spaces. But I have yet to find anything that does that. But as is with deep linking, that's sort of the necessary evil right now. So there's a bunch of resources if you are interested in doing a Hypermedia API. The API Craft Google group is really excellent. They're very open to from simplest questions to really complex questions. If you're thinking about using Hypermedia in your APIs, I highly recommend you just look at the archives there or post something if you have questions. My slides are up if you want to look at them. There is a really fancy HAL browser, which is a web app that will automatically let you connect to a Hypermedia API, and it will let you follow links and sort of scan around and inspect what link relations are present on the API. Client libraries for consuming API. for AngularJS, there's an existing one, Angular Hyper Resource. I have a library, Angular High Res, that's fairly new, but doing a lot of the stuff that you saw in my slides. If you're doing Ruby, Hyper Resource is a really nice Ruby library for consuming Hypermedia APIs. Python has REST Navigator. And then on the server side, I happen for work because we're enterprisey, we use Java. So HAL Builder is a really nice library for creating your Hypermedia responses in your API. On the Ruby side, if you're doing any sort of Rails development, Roar is a really nice library. Resource Object Representer, I forget what it stands for. It lets you, among other things, carefully craft what your API responses will look like, including those hypermedia controls, those link relations that you want to have. So, questions? Yes.
Notice that previous second you were
Mm-hmm.
the links always have to be there in each of the posts in that example. Have its own link section.
Yes, and actually,
You tell it what each post should do.
yes, and I actually, in the interest of space on my slides, didn't show that. But fundamentally, here we go. Fundamentally, posts here, I didn't want to scare anyone too off. Really, posts, if you were doing HAL the way HAL is intended to be, posts would probably actually be embedded resources. They technically would be a resource that's elsewhere that we have to be embedding partially in our response. And embedded resources are also followed by link relation, and among other things, they have a self-link relation that would be the URL to that post. Most definitely. If you wanted to have your view have an individual link to click on each of these, you would inspect the self-link relation on the embedded post for how to follow it. Yes, very much so. I wanted to fit my slide on one screen, so I didn't. But yes, that is exactly it. So you don't need to figure out how to get to that particular post. You'd have a link to it in your response. Yes. Yep.
I missed the first 3 minutes.
Okay.
Just in case I might have said it. WordPress 4.1 coming out.
Okay.
It has this WP API, which is the OS
Okay.
API. So
Cool.
20% of the sites there that are going to have this.
Phenomenal. Do you know what media type they're using? Like, how are they including the link relations?
Same thing, list of links.
Okay.
So you go to whatever site is API.
Yep.
Generates that JSON.
And it'll have all that where you can follow to get to next. Cool. Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, I also have a sample backbone app that
Consumes it.
that API. You can point it at any server.
Yeah, cool.
See the response.
Nice. Yeah. Very cool. Yes.
Are there any standards? You mentioned this how, like,
Yeah.
is that like all applications that are
Yeah, and so the core concepts are present. There are a lot of different media types, and this is one of the things I was talking about, tooling still evolving. Sorry for everyone. The question was the standard media type, whether this is a standard thing. HAL is one of several that are out there right now that are working on sort of being standardized, figuring out what fits best. There are a bunch, honestly, and I think as we move forward, that some will start being seen as clear winners, and they'll get more use, and we'll see more libraries around consuming them. HAL is one, Siren's another. There's another called Uber. There's JSON-LD, which is a sort of a little bigger scope. It's sort of adding RDF-type semantics on top of JSON. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that people are doing this. I particularly like HAL because it's really sort of unobtrusive. There's an underscore links and an underscore embedded, and that's it. The rest is sort of the thing you would expect. With some JSON properties, you can easily access them. Some of them sort of have different structure that I find makes it harder to write clients to consume those APIs. The simple stuff, like I want to put the product name on the screen. With some of those other formats, it's not as easy to get to them. But HAL's one of them, Siren, Uber, JSON API is another. All of them at various stages of standardization. HAL itself does have an RFC right now. I don't know that I linked to it. It's at like seventh iteration. They're working on getting it finalized. Some of the others, I'm not sure if they're through full like task force and concrete standardization. A lot of the stuff, the web linking stuff, what is a link, URI templates for having sort of introducing state, all those are already standardized. The actual media types are evolving. So I think in the next year or two, we'll see some of them be like clear winners. Amazon, one of the recent APIs, started using HAL for the media type. So there's an example of some more uptake of these specific hypermedia media types in places. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just curious on how this seems to mesh well with Angular.js.
Yep.
Do you see Angular as in the ascendancy and ultimately trump the other client side?
I don't. I think it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I happen to like Angular. I think it's really well designed. It fits well with a lot of the concepts that I learned from doing a lot of thick client development, dependency injection, and nice isolation and clean code separation. So I happen to like Angular, and it lets you do nice things like this very easily. But I don't think there's one sort of end-all for these things. Knockout's really nice. I mean, there are plenty of other of those sort of single-page application JavaScript frameworks that could just as easily do this. I don't think necessarily. I think there's always going to be different preferences and different tastes. Yeah.
Is there any standardization coming out for different method types that link supports? These are all GIFs, but...
Yeah, so there's some debate on that. Some of the media types specifically include the HTTP methods that are allowed to be called on a particular link relation. I think Uber may and Siren might. So they'll say, okay, this link relation, you can either do a get, a head, or an options, or a post to this, for instance. Some of them include that. Other people are a little more pedantic and say what you can do is implicit in the link relation, and that's part of your documentation. Some people say, okay, you should know that a verify link based on link relation, I had the verify thing, is something that you can do a get or a post on, for instance. There's some debate and argument there about whether it's inherent in the link relation or something that should be included in your media type. And some do and some don't.
Is the media type for those media types included within the response so that you could have one client library that you need?
Yeah, so you certainly could. Typically, you'd use the content type header for that.
Okay. Metadata.
Yeah, so it'd be an HTTP header. It would be the metadata about what I'm getting back. The library, the Angular high-res that I'm working on right now just supports HAL, but you could just as easily, based on the content type that comes back, inspect the links for some other media type, or inspect the link headers and do that. Yeah, exactly, right. And the accept header is like the way that if you wanted to write a server that supports hypermedia clients and non-hypermedia clients, you could very easily use the accept header, and if they accept application JSON, just return them data-centric, some fields with data, and if they send you an accept header of application/HAL plus JSON, you send back HAL, and you give them those hypermedia links. So it'd be very easy using content negotiation to control whether you want to have this gunk in there or not, depending on your your client side, whether they want to do hypermedia stuff or not. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, is there like a clear line where you sort of view the view stops? Like it's kind of crossing like why would somebody ever, let's say, embed style information?
So there are some people that have specifically been doing sort of single-page applications that use hypermedia, that use HTML as their media type. Meaning you could just as easily return some structured HTML for this, and it would be a bunch of A tags, and it would be maybe a bunch of a UL tag, and each LI would then have the structured content, because we're pretty good at parsing HTML, right? So there are some people that John Moore, who works for Comcast, he's got a lot of presentations online. If you Google him, he's got about using HTML as your media type. You can just as easily do that, and then you have that room for possibly introducing styling information and making it easy to have less processing to do, to not only have some API that programmatically we can deal with, but also something we can spit out on the screen and have be useful for the user. So I have mixed feelings about that, because it starts, now you're, okay, I'm using Bootstrap for my styling, so I'm going to return these Bootstrap-specific CSS classes. All of a sudden, you're tying your API to a particular view technology, and that runs the risk of, okay, 3 years down the line, we're not using Bootstrap anymore because Bootstrap's down the crapper, and we're using something else. Now we need to change our API to handle it. So I don't love that, but I think it's an interesting space to see where we might be able to have, you know, our cake and eat it too when it comes to both API and UI.
The other improvements are posting that HTML, like stuff.
Right. Yeah. I don't want there to be SOAP version 2. I've done enough SOAP. I don't want that. Yeah. And one of the things I didn't go over is forms. One of the other things that people talk a lot about in API is forms, whereby not only will we have links you can follow, but your Hypermedia format might include details about how to fill out a form in order to create a blog post. Let's say you want to be able to let people create blog posts. Our API can tell us what fields we need in order to create a blog post. I mean, in Ruby on Rails, it's the traditional, like, you follow the edit link or the new link, and it returns us some HTML to create a new blog post. Some of these media types have definitions for what a form is, with different fields that should be filled out by the user and how to submit, where to submit that form once you complete it. HAL doesn't happen to have those. Some of the other ones do. I have mixed feelings about that because oftentimes, as on the front end, we want to write a rich UI that works nicely, and we put this field here, and all those things I don't feel should be inherent in our API. And other people, they don't really care which field goes where, and they just want to automatically build out some UI based on what the API returns us, and that's where Hypermedia forms can be really handy. So it's really sort of depends on your taste and what you need to do with it. Personally, at work, we don't use forms. We assume that for a particular link relation, this link relation lets you do this with it, and we need to include this data to do it. And that's coupling. And it's a conscious decision we've made to, okay, we're okay with introducing coupling on these areas. And you can easily sort of get around that by, if you need to change what fields are required, you can introduce a different link relation. You can version your link relations. It's very easy to handle versioning automatically here and not break old clients. We can have the traditional edit link that our version 1 clients understood. And if now when we're editing a resource, we always need to include some CSRF token or whatever it is, some new thing, we can add a new link relation that's versioned, and our new clients can start consuming it. Our old clients follow the old link relation, and we haven't broken anyone. We have backwards compatibility, we have forwards compatibility, etc. So there's a lot of room for flexibility when you start doing this. Any other questions? I think I did good on time. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.